The rope around White Raven's neck drew tight as Sheriff Daniel Garrett pulled the noose skyward, his weathered face twisted with the kind of hatred that had festered for 5 long years. The old Navajo woman's feet barely touched the dusty ground beneath the hanging tree, her traditional dress torn and stained with blood from the rocks the townspeople had thrown. "Please." 9-year-old Isobel Martinez threw herself at Garrett's legs, her small fists pounding against his leather chaps. "She didn't do anything wrong. Get away from me, you little savage lover." Garrett backhanded her across the face, sending her sprawling into the dirt. Blood trickled from her split lip as she struggled to her feet, her dark eyes blazing with defiance that seemed impossible in someone so small. Behind them, the town of Bitter Creek had turned out in force to watch the execution. Men clutched rifles and pistols, their faces hard with the satisfaction of finally having someone to blame for their troubles. Women whispered behind their hands, while children peered between their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed at the spectacle of death about to unfold. "Now this is what happens," Garrett shouted to the crowd. "When we let their kind bring curses into our town, 3 children dead from the fever and more getting sick every day. It started when she showed up, and it'll end when she's gone." White Raven's lips moved in what might have been a prayer, her dark eyes focused on something beyond the angry faces surrounding her. At 62, she had survived winters that killed stronger people, had delivered babies in howling blizzards, had eased the dying with herbs and gentle words. But she had never faced hatred this pure, this absolute. Sheriff Garrett, Martha Holloway pushed through the crowd, her black dress marking her as the preacher's widow. "You can't do this. There's been no trial, no trial." Burke the rancher laughed a sound like breaking glass. "My boy's been puking blood for a week. That's all the trial I need." He spat in the dirt near White Raven's feet. "Indian witch probably cursed the water just like they cursed my cattle last spring." The crowd murmured agreement, their voices rising like the buzz of angry wasps. These were people who had watched too many loved ones die, who had buried too many dreams in the harsh soil of New Mexico territory. They needed someone to blame, and the strange old woman who had wandered into their town seemed like Providence itself. Isobel scrambled to her feet, ignoring the blood streaming down her chin. 3 months of wandering the desert after her parents drowned in the Rio Grande had taught her that survival meant never giving up, no matter how hopeless things seemed. "She saved my life." Isobel's voice cracked with desperation. "When I was dying of thirst out there, she gave me water. She shared her food. She's not evil. She's good." "Good." Tommy Garrett stepped out from behind his father, his 12-year-old face twisted with premature cruelty. "Indians ain't good, stupid. Pa says they're all murderers and thieves." The boy picked up a rock and hurled it at White Raven's head. It struck her temple, opening a gash that sent blood streaming down her weathered cheek. She didn't cry out, didn't even flinch, but her eyes found Isobel's across the crowd. "Run, little one," she whispered in English, her voice barely audible above the mob's growing roar. "Run while you still can." But Isobel had nowhere to run. For 3 months, she had knocked on doors from Santa Fe to Silver City, begging for work, for food, for simple human kindness. Door after door had slammed in her face, leaving her and White Raven to survive on whatever they could scavenge from the unforgiving desert. Now, watching the woman who had become her only family about to die, Isobel felt something break inside her chest. Not her spirit that remained unbroken despite everything, but her last illusion that the world was a place where good things happened to good people. "Stop!" She threw herself between Garrett and White Raven, her small body trembling with rage and fear. "You want to kill someone. Kill me instead. I'm the one who brought her here." The crowd fell silent at her words, surprised by the fierce courage in someone so young. Even Garrett hesitated, his hand loosening slightly on the rope. It was then that the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, and 3 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking town. They sat their horses like statues carved from stone, their faces painted with war paint that seemed to glow in the harsh afternoon sun. Navajo warriors armed with rifles and traditional weapons, their eyes fixed on the scene below, with the cold calculation of men who had come to settle a debt. "Ah, Jesus Christ," someone in the crowd whispered. "It's a war party." Garrett's hand tightened on his gun, but he didn't draw it. 3 against 30 should have been no contest, but something in the warriors' stillness suggested they had not come to die easily. The lead warrior, a man with silver threads in his black hair, called out in accented English, "Release the grandmother, or this town burns before sunset." "Go to hell," Garrett shouted back, but his voice lacked conviction. He had seen what Navajo warriors could do when their blood was up, had helped bury the remains of wagon trains that had crossed them. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring both sides, waiting for someone to make the first move. In the silence, White Raven's labored breathing seemed loud as thunder, and Isobel could smell the fear sweat of the crowd, despite their superior numbers. Then from somewhere in the mob came a child's voice. "Papa, the water tastes funny again." The words were barely audible, but they seemed to freeze everyone in place. Billy Burke, the rancher's 8-year-old son, pushed through the adults to tug at his father's sleeve. "The water from the well." Billy said, his young face pale and drawn. "It tastes like pennies and it makes my tummy hurt." Burke looked down at his son, then at White Raven, then at the crowd of neighbors who had been so eager for vengeance just moments before. A terrible understanding began to dawn in his eyes. "The well," he said slowly. "When did you first notice the taste, boy?" 2 months ago, Billy replied. "Right after the big rain when the water got all muddy." The crowd began to murmur pieces of a puzzle falling into place. The sickness had indeed started 2 months ago, but White Raven had only arrived in town 3 days ago. Even the most fevered imagination couldn't blame her for poisoning water before she had arrived. "The mine," Martha Holloway said suddenly, her voice cutting through the growing noise. "The old silver mine up in the hills. All that runoff has to go somewhere." "Shut up," Garrett snarled, but the damage was done. Doubt had crept into the crowd like smoke, and with it came the horrible realization that they might be about to murder an innocent woman. White Raven chose that moment to speak her voice, carrying, despite her weakened condition, "Test the water. Test it properly. You will find mercury led other poisons from the mining. The children are sick because the earth itself is poisoned." "She's lying," Tommy Garrett shouted, his young voice shrill with panic. "Pa, she's trying to trick us." But even as he spoke, more voices from the crowd began to join Billy's testimony. The water had tasted strange for weeks. The children had started getting sick before the old woman arrived. The timing didn't match their accusations. Burke's face had gone gray as winter sky. "My God," he whispered. "What have we done?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. And in the silence that followed, everyone could hear the terrible answer. They had been so desperate to find someone to blame that they had nearly committed murder rather than face the truth. Garrett's hand began to shake on the rope, his certainty crumbling like sand in the wind. He looked at his son, then at the crowd, then at White Raven's blood-streaked face. "Cut her down," Martha said quietly. "Cut her down right now before we all have to answer to God for what we've done." But Garrett wasn't ready to surrender his hatred so easily. 5 years of blaming Indians for his brother's death had given shape to his grief purpose, to his pain. Without that hatred, he would have to face the empty hole in his heart where Tom's laughter used to live. "No," he said, his voice hardening again. "No, she's still responsible. Maybe not for the water, but for other things. For being here, for being what she is." The words sounded hollow even to him. but he clung to them like a drowning man clutching driftwood. Around him, the crowd began to fragment, some moving away from the hanging tree, others pressing closer with renewed bloodlust. It was then that Isobel made her move. 3 months of surviving in the desert had taught her to read danger like other children read storybooks. She could see the madness in Garrett's eyes, the way his finger twitched on the trigger of his gun. In another few seconds, bullets would start flying, and White Raven would die in the crossfire, whether she was hanged or not. With a speed that surprised everyone, including herself, Isobel snatched a burning brand from the blacksmith's forge and swung it in a wide arc, scattering the crowd and creating a pocket of clear space around the hanging tree. "Get back," she screamed, her small face savage with determination. "All of you get back." The flame caught the dry wood of the gallows, and within seconds, the entire structure was ablaze. Garrett was forced to release the rope or be burned alive, and White Raven collapsed to the ground, gasping and clutching at her throat. "You little bitch." Garrett raised his gun to shoot Isobel down like a rabid dog, but before he could pull the trigger, the Navajo warriors were among them. They had used the distraction of the fire to charge down from the ridge, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they thundered into the crowd. The lead warrior's rifle butt caught Garrett in the temple, dropping him like a felled tree, while his companions created a protective circle around White Raven and Isobel. For a moment, it seemed like a massacre was inevitable. The townspeople had guns, but they were scattered and confused, while the warriors moved with the coordinated precision of men who had fought together for years. But then White Raven struggled to her feet, one hand on her throat, the other raised in a gesture of peace. "Nope," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the square. "No more violence. Too much blood has been spilled already." The lead warrior, whose name was Joseph Crow Feather, though the white men would never learn it, looked down at her with concern. "Grandmother, they tried to kill you. Honor demands that we be better than they are," White Raven replied, switching to Navajo. Her words carried the authority of someone who had delivered half the babies in her village and eased the dying of the other half. "Help me to the well. If I am to prove my innocence, I must do it their way." The crowd parted like the Red Sea as White Raven made her slow way to the town, well supported by Isobel on one side and Crow Feather on the other. Her legs shook with every step, and blood still trickled from the gash on her temple, but her eyes were clear and focused. Martha Holloway had already drawn a bucket of water from the well, and she held it out to White Raven with hands that trembled slightly. "I don't know much about testing for poisons," she admitted. "I do." White Raven took the bucket and held it up to the light, studying the clear liquid with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades brewing medicines from plants and minerals. Then she smelled it, her nose wrinkling at an odor too faint for most people to detect. "Mercury," she said finally, "and lead, and something else." She dipped a finger into the water and touched it to her tongue, spitting immediately. "Arsenic. From the mine tailings, all of it. This water has been poisoned for months, maybe years. It's a miracle more people haven't died." Burke pushed through the crowd, his son Billy clinging to his hand. The rancher's face was a mask of anguish as he looked at the bucket, then at White Raven, then at his sick child. Can you fix him?" he asked, his voice breaking. "My boy, can you make him well?" White Raven knelt down to Billy's level, ignoring her own pain, as she placed gentle hands on the child's face. His skin was pale and clammy, his eyes ringed with the dark circles that spoke of systemic poisoning. "The damage is not too severe," she said after a moment. "He is young, and the young heal quickly when given proper treatment. But he will need medicine and care and clean water to drink." "I will get it," Burke said desperately. "Whatever you need, we'll get it. Just, please, help him." White Raven looked around at the crowd of faces surrounding her, some hostile, some curious, some desperate with hope. These were the same people who had tried to hang her less than an hour ago, who had thrown rocks at her and called her a witch. But they were also parents watching their children die, people frightened and confused and looking for someone, anyone, who could make the pain stop. "I will need my medicine bag," she said finally. "And herbs from the desert. Some I can find here, others." She looked at Crow Feather, who nodded understanding. "We brought them," he said in English. "Everything you might need. We came prepared to take you home, but if you choose to stay—" "I choose to heal," White Raven replied. "That is what I do. That is who I am." The next few hours passed like a fever dream. White Raven, despite her injuries, threw herself into treating the sick children with the focused intensity of someone who had found her purpose again. She brewed teas and tinctures, ground herbs and minerals, all while explaining to Martha and the other women what she was doing and why. Isobel served as her assistant, fetching water and holding children steady, while White Raven examined them. The girl's small hands proved surprisingly gentle as she helped administer medicines and whispered words of comfort to frightened patients. By sunset, 7 children had been treated, and all were showing signs of improvement. Billy Burke was sitting up in bed for the first time in days, color returning to his cheeks as the purging medicines did their work. But the real test came when Sheriff Garrett finally regained consciousness. He woke to find himself tied to a chair in the jail cell that had been meant for White Raven, his head pounding from the rifle butt that had knocked him senseless. Through the barred window, he could see people moving back and forth across the square, their voices carrying snatches of conversation about clean water and medicine and recovery. Martha Holloway sat in the chair across from his cell, her black dress replaced by a stained apron that spoke of long hours spent nursing sick children. "How do you feel, Daniel?" she asked quietly. "Like I got kicked by a mule." He tested his bonds, found them secure, and slumped back in the chair. "I suppose you're here to gloat." "I'm here to tell you that your son is asking for you," Martha replied. "He's been asking for you for hours, ever since he woke up from the fever." Garrett's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly alert. "Tommy, is he—" "He's fine. The Indian woman, White Raven, she treated him along with the others. Gave him medicine, sat with him while he was delirious, made sure he had clean water to drink." Martha's voice was carefully neutral, but her eyes held judgment. "She saved his life, Daniel. Just like she saved all their lives. That doesn't change anything," Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She's still an Indian, still one of them." "One of who?" Martha leaned forward in her chair. "One of the people who killed your brother, or one of the people who just spent the last 6 hours saving your son." The question hit Garrett like a physical blow, and he closed his eyes against the pain of it. For 5 years, his hatred had been simple and pure. Indians had killed Tom during a raid on a supply wagon, therefore all Indians were his enemies. It was a clean equation, one that made sense in a world where nothing else did. But now that equation was complicated by the image of White Raven's gentle hands on his son's fevered forehead, by the sight of her brewing medicines while blood still trickled from the wound his rope had left on her throat. "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't know anything anymore." Martha stood up, her hand moving to the keys at her belt. "That's the first honest thing you've said in years, Daniel. Maybe it's a start." She unlocked the cell door and stepped aside. "Your son is at the Hendersons' house. White Raven is there too, making sure all the children get through the night safely. If you want to see him." Garrett stood slowly, his legs unsteady from the blow to his head. "Why are you letting me go, after what I tried to do?" "Because," Martha said quietly, "someone has to be the first to choose forgiveness over revenge. Might as well be me." The walk to the Henderson house was the longest of Garrett's life. Every step took him further from the comfortable certainty of his hatred and closer to a reckoning he wasn't sure he was ready for. He found White Raven in the front room brewing tea over the fireplace, while Mrs. Henderson held her grandson. The old woman looked up when he entered, her dark eyes studying his face with the same careful attention she had given the poisoned water. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "you have come to see your son." It wasn't a question, and Garrett found himself nodding. "Is he—" "He is sleeping. The fever broke an hour ago." White Raven poured tea into a cup and held it out to him. "Drink. You look like a man who has been walking through storms." Garrett stared at the cup, then at the woman offering it. This was his enemy, the person he had tried to murder just hours ago. By every rule of logic and justice, she should have refused to treat his son, should have let the boy die as payment for his father's sins. Instead, she was offering him tea. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why? After what I did. Why would you—" "Because," White Raven said simply, "healing is what I do. And healing means healing everyone, not just the people who are kind to us." Garrett took the cup with hands that shook slightly. The tea was bitter but warm, and it seemed to steady something inside him that had been trembling for 5 years. "My brother," he said suddenly. "The raid where he died. You wouldn't have had anything to do with that, would you?" White Raven was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant with memory. "I was not there," she said finally. "But I have heard the stories. Young men angry at the loss of their hunting grounds, striking out at the white settlers they blamed for their troubles. They killed him." Garrett said, the old pain sharp in his voice. "Cut him down like he was nothing. Wandaum, and you have been carrying that anger ever since," White Raven observed. "It has been eating at you like poison, just like the mercury in your well water. Making you sick, making you do terrible things." Garrett looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since she had arrived in town. He saw the wisdom in her weathered face, the gentleness in her hands, the strength that had carried her through 6 decades of life on the frontier. "How do I stop?" he asked. "How do I let go of something that's been part of me for so long?" "The same way you heal from any poison," White Raven replied. "One day at a time, one small choice at a time. Choose not to hate today. Tomorrow choose again. Eventually, the poison will work its way out of your system." A sound from the back room drew their attention, a child's voice calling out weakly. Garrett was on his feet before he realized he was moving, hurrying toward the sound of his son's voice. Tommy was sitting up in bed, his face pale but alert, his eyes bright with fever that was finally breaking. When he saw his father, he held out his arms like the child he still was, despite his earlier displays of cruelty. "Pa," he whispered. "I was scared. I thought I was going to die." Garrett gathered his son into his arms, feeling the small body tremble against his chest. "You're not going to die," he said fiercely. "Not you, not ever. I won't let anything happen to you." "The Indian lady," Tommy said, his voice muffled against his father's shoulder. "She gave me medicine, made me feel better. I was mean to her before, wasn't I?" "Yes," Garrett said, surprising himself with his honesty. "We both were. We were both very mean to her. Should we say sorry?" The question was asked with the innocent directness that only children possessed, but it cut through all of Garrett's adult complications and defenses like a knife through paper. "Yes," he said finally. "I think we should." When they returned to the front room, they found White Raven packing her medicine bag, her movements slow and careful as she wrapped each herb bundle in protective cloth. "You're leaving?" Garrett asked. "My work here is done," she replied. "The children are healing, and you have learned what you needed to learn about the water. There is nothing more I can do." "But there is," Garrett said urgently. "You could stay. Help us set up proper medical care, teach our women about healing, make sure something like this never happens again." White Raven paused in her packing, studying his face. "And you would welcome me after everything that has passed between us?" "I would be honored," Garrett said, and meant it. I've been wrong about so many things. Maybe it's time I started being right about something. It was then that Crow Feather stepped into the room, his war paint washed away, to reveal a face marked by intelligence and careful judgment. He had been listening from the doorway, and now he moved to stand beside White Raven. The grandmother must make her own choice, he said in careful English. But if she stays, she will not be alone. We have been watching from the hills, and we have seen how this town treats strangers. If she chooses to remain, some of us will remain as well to make sure she is safe. A permanent camp. Garrett's training as a lawman made him automatically consider the implications armed Indians living near a white settlement, the potential for conflict, the fear it would generate among the townspeople. But then he looked at his son, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, and at White Raven, whose medicines had saved not just Tommy, but 7 other children as well. "There's good hunting in the hills," he said finally. "And we'll need someone to help monitor the water quality, make sure the mine runoff doesn't poison any more wells. Seems like a fair trade to me." Crow Feather nodded slowly. "A fair trade," he agreed. White Raven looked from one man to the other, and then at Isobel, who had been sitting quietly in the corner throughout the entire conversation. The girl's dark eyes were bright with hope, but also with the patient wariness of someone who had learned not to count on good things lasting. "What do you think, little one?" White Raven asked. "Should we stay and see if these people can learn to be better than they were?" Isobel considered the question with the seriousness of someone far older than her 9 years. She thought about the doors that had slammed in her face, the rocks that had been thrown, the rope that had been placed around White Raven's neck. But she also thought about Martha's kindness, about Billy Burke's innocent honesty, about the way Sheriff Garrett's face had changed when he realized his son had been saved by the woman he had tried to murder. "I think," she said slowly, "that sometimes people need a chance to be better. And sometimes," she looked directly at Garrett, "being better starts with saying you're sorry." The silence that followed was broken by Sheriff Garrett clearing his throat. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he had kept bottled up for too long. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "For the rope, for the hatred, for teaching my son to hate people he'd never met. I'm sorry for all of it. And I'm sorry too," Tommy added in a small voice, "for throwing rocks and saying mean things." White Raven looked at them both for a long moment, her weathered face unreadable. Then slowly, she began to smile. "Apologies are like medicine," she said. "They don't work unless you really mean them. But when you do..." She reached out and placed a gentle hand on Garrett's arm. "When you do, they can heal wounds that have been festering for years." Burke appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands, and his face marked by exhaustion and relief. "My Billy's asking for you," he told White Raven. "Wants to know if you'll teach him about the plants you use for medicine." "I would be honored," White Raven replied. "A healer should always be training the next generation." As the evening wore on and more families came to check on their children, the house filled with the sound of quiet conversation and tentative laughter. The crisis was over, but the real work, the work of building trust between people who had nearly destroyed each other, was just beginning. Isobel found herself standing on the front porch, looking out at the town square where the gallows had burned down to ash and charcoal. Martha Holloway joined her, settling onto the porch swing with a sigh of exhaustion. "Quite a day," Martha observed. "Yes, ma'am," Isobel agreed. Do you think things will really be different now?" Martha was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I think," she said finally, "that people are like that poisoned water. Sometimes they carry bad things inside them for so long that they forget what it feels like to be clean. But if you give them a chance to purge the poison..." She smiled at Isobel. "Well, Maybe they can be clean again? White Raven says I can be her apprentice, Isobel said. Learn about healing and herbs and taking care of people. Do you think I'd be good at it? Shelter, Martha said, reaching over to squeeze Isobel's hand. You've been taking care of people since the day you were born. It's who you are. As if summoned by their conversation, White Raven emerged from the house, her medicine bag slung over her shoulder, and a look of quiet satisfaction on her face. All the children will recover, she announced. Some will take longer than others, but they will all be well. And now, she settled onto the porch beside Isobel. Now we must talk about the future. Are we really staying? Isobel asked. For a while, White Raven confirmed. Long enough to make sure the healing takes hold both in the children and in the town. And long enough to teach you everything I know about the healing arts. Why me? Isobel asked. I'm not special, I'm just a girl who knocked on every door in town looking for help. White Raven interrupted gently. Just a child who threw herself between a mob and a dying woman. Just someone who risked her own life to save the son of a man who wanted to murder her. She smiled. If that is not special, then I do not know what is. I do. Isobel felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from hope rather than despair. For the first time since her parents had died, she felt like she belonged somewhere, like she had found her place in the world. Will you teach me the songs too? She asked. The healing songs in your language. I will teach you everything, White Raven promised. The songs, the stories, the old ways, and the new. You will be a bridge between worlds, little one. You will carry the best of both peoples forward into the future. As the stars began to appear in the desert sky, the three women sat in comfortable silence, each lost in her own thoughts about the day's extraordinary events. In the distance, they could see the glow of campfires in the hills where Crowfeather and his companions had made their camp a visible reminder that White Raven was no longer alone and vulnerable. Martha, White Raven said suddenly, there is something I must ask you. What is it? The church. I noticed it has been empty for some time. No preacher, no services. Martha nodded sadly. Reverend Patterson died 2 years ago, and we haven't been able to find a replacement. The denomination says our town is too small, too remote. Perhaps, White Raven said thoughtfully, it is time for a different kind of church. One that brings people together instead of keeping them apart. One that teaches healing instead of judgment. You mean you would... Martha's eyes widened with possibility. But you're not Christian. How could you lead a Christian church? I am not Christian, White Raven agreed. But I believe in the same things your Jesus taught. Love, forgiveness, healing the sick, caring for the outcast. Perhaps the name of the God matters less than the goodness of the heart. The idea was radical, unthinkable by the standards of the time. But then, everything about this day had been unthinkable. A town had nearly committed murder, a woman had forgiven her. Would-be killers' enemies had become allies, and children had been saved by someone they had tried to destroy. If all of that was possible, Martha thought, then perhaps anything was possible. We'll need to talk to the others, she said carefully. Some people might not be ready for such a progressive approach to worship. Change is like medicine, White Raven observed. It works best when taken in small doses over time. We will start slowly with simple things. Healing services for the sick, blessing ceremonies for new babies gathering to share food and stories. Eventually, people will realize that the form of worship matters less than the spirit behind it. As they continued to plan and dream, none of them noticed the small figure watching from the shadows beside the house. Burke's son Billy had crept out of bed to listen to their conversation, his young mind absorbing every word with the intensity of someone who had just learned that the world was far more complicated and wonderful than he had ever imagined. Years later, when Billy Burke had grown up to become a doctor himself, he would tell people that his calling had begun that night, listening to 3 women plan a revolution disguised as a church service. He would tell them about the Indian healer who had saved his life, about the Mexican girl who had become a bridge between worlds, about the preacher's widow who had chosen love over law and forgiveness over revenge. But that was still in the future. For now he was just a sick boy who had been healed, creeping back to his bed, with his head full of dreams about a world where differences were celebrated rather than feared, where healing was more important than hatred, where the color of someone's skin mattered less than the contents of their heart. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made everything seem possible. White Raven woke early, as was her custom, and made her way to the town well to draw water for the morning's tea. She found Sheriff Garrett already there, staring down into the depths of the well with a troubled expression. "Second thoughts?" she asked gently. "About what happened yesterday, no." Garrett shook his head firmly. "About what happens next every minute." He gestured toward the well. "We're going to have to close this off, find a new water source. That means expense disruption, admitting to everyone who wasn't here yesterday that we nearly hanged an innocent woman because we were too scared to look for the real problem. And that frightens you." "Terrifies me," Garrett admitted. "I've been sheriff of this town for 8 years, and in all that time, I've never had to admit I was wrong about something this important. People trusted me to protect them, and instead, I almost got them all killed by ignoring the real threat." White Raven was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "In my village," she said finally, "there is a saying. The leader who never makes mistakes is the leader who never makes decisions. You made a mistake, yes, a terrible one that could have cost lives. But when you learned the truth, you chose to change course rather than continuing on the wrong path. That takes a different kind of courage, does it?" Garrett's voice was bitter. "Or does it just make me a coward who was too afraid to admit he was wrong until he had no choice?" "You had a choice," White Raven pointed out. "You could have gone through with the hanging, ignored the evidence about the water, convinced yourself that everything bad that happened was someone else's fault. Many men would have chosen that path." Garrett knew she was right, but the knowledge didn't make him feel any better about himself. He had come within minutes of committing murder, had taught his son to hate people for no better reason than the color of their skin, had let his grief over his brother's death poison him against an entire race of people. "Aram, how do I face the territorial authorities?" he asked. "How do I explain that I nearly hanged a woman without a trial because I thought she was a witch?" "The same way you face everything else," White Raven replied. "One day at a time, one honest word at a time. Tell them the truth, that you made a mistake, that you learned from it, that you're working to make sure it never happens again. And if they decide to arrest me to put me on trial for attempted murder," White Raven smiled, "then you will face that too. But I do not think it will come to that. You are not the first lawman to let fear cloud his judgment, and you will not be the last. What matters is what you do now, not what you did yesterday." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Martha, carrying a basket of fresh bread, and a determined expression that suggested she had made some important decisions during the night. "Hey, Daniel, I'm glad you're here," she said briskly. "We need to talk about the water situation, and we need to do it now before rumors start spreading to the other settlements." Garrett nodded grimly. "I've been thinking the same thing. If word gets out that our water's been poisoned for months, it could panic the whole territory. More than that," Martha continued, "it could ruin us economically. Who's going to want to trade with a town that can't even keep its water supply clean? We need to get ahead of this control, the story, before it controls us." White Raven listened to their planning with growing interest. These were practical people, she realized, the kind who survived on the frontier by adapting quickly to changing circumstances. Yesterday, they had been a mob ready to commit murder. Today, they were already working to solve the real problems that had created the crisis in the first place. "There's something else," Martha said, lowering her voice. "I've been thinking about what you said last night about the church. I talked to several of the women this morning, and they're interested. Cautiously interested, but interested nonetheless." "What kind of interest?" White Raven asked. "The kind that comes from watching their children nearly die while the official medicine failed them," Martha replied. "They want to know about your healing methods, about the herbs you use, about whether you could teach them to recognize the signs of poisoning before it becomes fatal." "And the men?" Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "The men are coming around. Slowly. Burke's been telling everyone who'll listen about how you saved Billy's life. That carries weight, especially with the other fathers. But there are still some who think yesterday was a fluke, that you got lucky with the diagnoses. They want more proof before they're willing to trust you completely." White Raven nodded. She had expected as much. Trust once broken was not easily repaired, and she had arrived in town as a stranger with strange ways and stranger beliefs. "Then we give them proof," she said simply. "Not through words, but through actions. Through healing, through teaching, through showing them that knowledge is more powerful than fear." Over the next several days, White Raven threw herself into the work of healing with the focused intensity of someone who had found her true calling. She treated not just the children who had been poisoned by the well water, but also the chronic ailments that had been plaguing the adult population: arthritis, eased with willow bark tea; infected wounds, cleaned with honey and herbs; persistent coughs, soothed with remedies brewed from desert plants. Isobel proved to be an eager and capable apprentice, her small hands gentle with frightened children, and her quick mind absorbing the complex relationships between different herbs and their effects. She showed a particular talent for diagnosis, able to spot the subtle signs of illness that even experienced healers might miss. "You have the gift," White Raven told her one afternoon as they gathered medicinal plants in the hills outside town. "The ability to see beneath the surface, to understand what the body is trying to tell you through its symptoms." "Is that why you chose me?" Isobel asked, carefully cutting a branch of wild mint. "Because I have the gift, I chose you," White Raven replied. "Because you have something much rarer than talent. You have compassion that cannot be taught, courage that cannot be broken, and a heart that refuses to hate, even when hatred would be easier." As they worked, Crow Feather and his companions maintained their vigil from the hills, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough away to avoid creating tension with the townspeople. The arrangement seemed to work well for everyone involved. The town felt protected from outside threats, while White Raven felt secure in the knowledge that she had allies nearby. The real test of the new peace came when a group of territorial officials arrived in town, drawn by reports of unusual activity and armed Indians in the area. Marshal Tom Bradley was a hard man with the kind of black-and-white worldview that had served him well in his years of law enforcement, but which left little room for the nuanced realities of life on the frontier. "Sheriff Garrett," he said, dismounting from his horse with the crisp efficiency of a man accustomed to command, "I've had reports of vigilante activity in your town. Something about a near lynching and unauthorized Indian encampments. I'm here to investigate." Garrett felt his stomach clench with familiar fear, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. "Marshal Bradley, I'm glad you're here. There are some things we need to discuss, and I'd rather you heard them from me than from gossip and speculation." Over the next hour, in the privacy of the sheriff's office, Garrett laid out the entire story: the poisoned water, the sick children, the mob's misguided attempt to find a scapegoat, and White Raven's role in exposing the truth and healing the victims. Bradley listened without interruption, his weathered face giving away nothing of his thoughts. When Garrett finished, the marshal was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the implications of what he had heard. "You're telling me," he said finally, "that you organized a lynch mob to hang an innocent woman, and that the only thing that prevented a murder was the intervention of armed Navajo warriors." "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Garrett replied, "and I'm also telling you that if you want to arrest me for it, I won't resist. What I did was wrong, and I'm prepared to face the consequences." "And the Indians, are they still in the area?" "They are, but they're not causing trouble. They're protecting the woman who saved our children's lives. They have every right to be here, and as long as I'm sheriff, they're welcome to stay." Bradley stood up and began pacing around the small office, his boots clicking on the wooden floor as he tried to process everything he had heard. This was not the kind of situation they had taught him to handle in his years of training, and he wasn't sure what the appropriate response should be. "I need to see this woman," he said finally. "Need to talk to her myself, assess whether she represents a threat to territorial security." "She's not a threat," Garrett said firmly. "She's a healer, but if you want to meet her, I'll arrange it." They found White Raven in the makeshift clinic that had been set up in the old church building, treating a rancher's wife for a persistent fever, while Isobel ground herbs at a nearby table. The sight of the two figures working together, the elderly Navajo woman with her traditional dress and silver jewelry, the young Mexican girl with her dark hair braided in the Indian style, seemed to capture everything that was both wonderful and unsettling about the new arrangements in Bitter Creek. "Ma'am," Bradley said, removing his hat as he entered the church. "I'm Marshal Tom Bradley, Territorial Law Enforcement. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if you don't mind." White Raven looked up from her patient, studying the marshal's face with the same careful attention she gave to symptoms of illness. "Of course, Marshal. But please let me finish here first. Mrs. Patterson's fever has been stubborn, and the timing of the medicine is important." Bradley watched as she completed her treatment, noting the gentle efficiency of her movements and the obvious trust her patient placed in her skills. When she was finished, she gestured for him to sit on one of the church pews while she settled herself across from him. "You have questions," she said simply. "Ask them. Are you planning to stay in this area permanently?" "For now, yes. The children need continued monitoring to ensure their recovery, and there is much work to be done in establishing a proper medical practice here." "Well, and the warriors in the hills, are they under your command?" White Raven smiled at the question. "Marshal, I am a 62-year-old woman who treats sick children and grows herbs. I do not command warriors. They are here because they choose to be, because they believe I should be protected while I do my work." "Protected from what?" "From people who might decide that fear is more important than healing," she replied, her dark eyes meeting his steadily. "Yesterday, this town nearly made a terrible mistake. My friends in the hills are here to ensure that such a mistake does not happen again." Bradley was quiet for a moment, clearly considering his options. "You realize that having armed Indians camped near a white settlement is going to make a lot of people nervous." "Yes," White Raven agreed. "Just as having white settlers building towns on traditional hunting grounds makes a lot of Indians nervous. Fear is a problem for everyone, Marshal. The question is whether we let that fear control us or whether we choose to find a better way." "And what would you suggest?" White Raven gestured toward Isobel, who had been listening quietly while continuing her work with the herbs. "Look at this child, Marshal. She is Mexican by birth, but she is learning Navajo healing methods and living in a white settlement. She belongs to all worlds and none, and she is stronger for it. Perhaps that is what this territory needs: more bridges between peoples, more understanding, less separation." Bradley looked at Isobel, really looked at her for the first time, and saw not just a child, but a symbol of possibility. Here was living proof that people of different races and cultures could work together, could learn from each other, could create something new and valuable from their combined strengths. The territorial government's policy, he said carefully, is to maintain separation between Indian and white populations, to minimize potential conflicts. And how well has that policy worked? White Raven asked gently. How many conflicts has it prevented? How many lives has it saved? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Bradley found himself thinking about all the raids, skirmishes, and massacres he had investigated over the years. All the fear and mistrust that seemed to grow stronger with each passing season rather than weaker. What are you proposing? He asked finally. Nothing radical, White Raven replied. Simply the right of people to live and work where they choose regardless of their ancestry. The right to trade freely, to share knowledge, to help each other in times of need. The things that should be basic human decency but which have become revolutionary ideas in this territory. Before Bradley could respond, the church door opened and Burke entered supporting his son Billy, who was still weak from his recent illness, but insisted on walking under his own power, on White Raven. Burke said, "Billy wanted to show you something." The boy stepped forward shyly, holding out a piece of paper covered with careful drawings of plants and flowers. "I've been practicing," he said, "drawing the medicine plants like you showed me. I want to learn to be a healer too." White Raven took the drawings and studied them with serious attention, nodding approvingly at the accuracy of the botanical details. "These are very good, Billy. You have a sharp eye for detail. That is important in a healer." "Can I really learn?" Billy asked eagerly. "Can I help people like you do?" "You can learn anything you set your mind to," White Raven assured him. "But first, you must get strong again. Healers must be healthy themselves before they can help others." As Burke led his son back outside, Bradley realized that he had just witnessed something significant. A white child, the son of a rancher who had participated in yesterday's near lynching, was now eager to learn from the woman his father had tried to murder. If that kind of transformation was possible, then perhaps the situation in Bitter Creek was not as dangerous as he had feared. Marshal, White Raven said, as if reading his thoughts, "What you have seen today is not the end of something, but the beginning. This town has learned that fear and hatred lead only to destruction. Now, they are ready to try a different path. And if I report this to my superiors, if they decide that the situation here is too irregular, to be allowed to continue." White Raven was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "Then you will have to decide whether you serve the law or justice, Marshal. Sometimes they are the same thing, but sometimes they are not." That evening, Bradley took his dinner at the hotel dining room, where he found himself surrounded by townspeople, eager to share their stories about the dramatic events of the previous day. He listened as they described their sick children, their fears about the water, their shame at how close they had come to committing murder. But more than shame, he heard something else in their voices: hope. Hope that they had found a better way forward, hope that their children would grow up in a world with less fear and more understanding. Marshal Martha Holloway said, approaching his table with a cup of coffee and a determined expression, "I hope you'll consider staying for our Sunday service. We're trying something new, and I think you might find it enlightening." "What kind of service?" "A healing service," Martha replied. "White Raven has agreed to share some of her knowledge about medicinal plants while I provide the Christian framework for worship. We're calling it Practical Christianity Faith that works to solve real problems rather than just promising rewards in the afterlife." Bradley nearly choked on his coffee. "A Navajo healer conducting Christian services. Martha, are you sure the church hierarchy is going to approve of this arrangement?" "The church hierarchy," Martha said with a tartness that surprised him, "hasn't sent us a preacher in 2 years. They've made it clear that our little town isn't important enough to warrant their attention. So we're creating our own version of Christianity, one that actually helps people instead of just judging them. The Sunday service that followed was unlike anything Bradley had ever experienced. The old church building was packed with townspeople, including several families who hadn't attended services in months. White Raven sat in the front pew, her traditional dress and silver jewelry making her stand out among the more conventional Sunday clothing of the other worshipers. Martha began with a traditional Christian prayer, then invited White Raven to the front of the church to demonstrate the preparation of several medicinal teas. As the Navajo healer worked, she explained the properties of each plant, the symptoms they could treat, and the proper methods of preparation. The Creator, she said using language that bridged both Christian and Navajo traditions, has provided us with everything we need to heal ourselves and each other. But we must be willing to learn to observe, to pay attention to the world around us. The congregation listened with rapt attention as she described how to recognize the early signs of mercury poisoning, how to prepare activated charcoal to absorb toxins, how to brew teas that could support the body's natural healing processes. This is not magic, White Raven emphasized. This is knowledge that has been tested over generations, passed down from healer to healer, because it works. The plants do not care whether you are Indian or white Christian or pagan. They will heal anyone who uses them correctly. When she finished her demonstration, Martha took over again, weaving White Raven's practical teachings into a sermon about Christian charity and the responsibility to care for one another. Jesus healed the sick, she reminded the congregation. He didn't ask about their race or their religion first. He saw need and he responded to it. That is what we are called to do, to see need and respond to it, regardless of who is in need or what they look like. As the service concluded with a hymn that seemed to blend Christian melodies with something older and more universal, Bradley found himself deeply moved by what he had witnessed. This was not the dangerous radicalism he had expected to find, but rather a practical Christianity that actually worked to solve problems and heal divisions. After the service, he sought out Sheriff Garrett for a private conversation. "I'm not going to file a report about what happened here," he said quietly. "As far as the territorial government is concerned, you handled a water contamination crisis with the help of a visiting medical practitioner. The details are nobody's business but yours." Garrett felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you, Marshal. I know I don't deserve—" "What you deserve," Bradley interrupted, "is a chance to prove that you've learned from your mistakes. Don't waste it." As Bradley prepared to leave town, he found himself thinking about the changes he had witnessed in just 3 days. A community that had been ready to commit murder had transformed itself into something approaching a model of racial cooperation. It wasn't perfect, there were still tensions, still people who grumbled about the new arrangements, but it was a beginning. The real test would come in the months and years ahead, as the initial shock of recent events faded and people had to decide whether to continue on the path of reconciliation or revert to their old patterns of fear and suspicion. But watching Isobel and Billy Burke work together in White Raven's garden, their different backgrounds irrelevant as they focused on learning about the healing properties of plants, Bradley felt cautiously optimistic about the future. Maybe, just maybe, this little town in the middle of nowhere had found a way to build something better than what had come before. The months that followed proved Bradley's optimism justified. The clinic that White Raven established in the old church building became a center of learning and healing that drew visitors from settlements across the territory. People came seeking treatment for ailments that traditional medicine couldn't cure, but they also came to learn about the innovative approaches to community building that had emerged from the crisis. Isobel grew into her role as White Raven's apprentice. With remarkable speed, her natural talent for healing enhanced by dedicated study and practice. She learned not only the Navajo healing traditions, but also began incorporating knowledge from Mexican folk medicine that she remembered from her childhood creating a unique synthesis of different healing approaches. Burke's son, Billy, proved to be equally dedicated to his studies, and by his 10th birthday, he could identify dozens of medicinal plants and prepare basic remedies under White Raven's supervision. The sight of the two children working together, one blonde and blue-eyed, the other dark-haired and brown-skinned, became a symbol of the new Bitter Creek. A living demonstration that cooperation was possible across racial lines. Sheriff Garrett kept his badge, but transformed his approach to law enforcement completely. Instead of relying on fear and intimidation, he began focusing on mediation and problem-solving, working to address the root causes of conflicts, rather than simply punishing their symptoms. His reputation for fairness and wisdom grew throughout the territory, and other towns began requesting his help in resolving their own disputes. The Navajo warriors who had initially come to protect White Raven gradually became integrated into the community's daily life. Crow Feather proved to have a talent for metalworking, and he established a forge near the town that produced both traditional Navajo silver jewelry and practical tools for the settlers. The cultural exchange that resulted enriched everyone involved as white families learned traditional crafts, while Navajo artisans incorporated new techniques into their work. Martha Holloway's innovative approach to Christianity attracted attention from religious leaders across the territory, some supportive and others deeply critical. But the practical results were undeniable. Her congregation was growing, her community was healing, and her approach to faith was producing tangible improvements in people's lives. The success of the Bitter Creek experiment did not go unnoticed by the territorial government, and eventually official recognition came in the form of a visit from the territorial governor himself. Governor Samuel Crawford was a practical politician who understood that successful policies needed to be replicated and unsuccessful ones abandoned. When he arrived in Bitter Creek 2 years after the crisis, he came prepared to evaluate the community's unusual arrangements with an open mind. What he found exceeded his expectations. The town had not only recovered from its near disaster, but had grown and prospered in ways that seemed almost miraculous. Property values had risen as word spread about the quality of medical care available in the community. Trade had increased as Navajo crafts and traditional medicines found eager markets among white settlers. Most importantly, the rate of violent crime had dropped to nearly zero as the community's emphasis on mediation and healing had replaced the old cycle of revenge and retaliation. This is remarkable, the governor told White Raven as she showed him through the expanded clinic. I've been governing this territory for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like what you've accomplished here. We have accomplished it, White Raven corrected gently. All of us together. I could not have done this alone, just as they could not have healed without help. Yes, but surely you understand that what you've created here is highly unusual. The territorial policy has always been to maintain separation between racial groups to minimize contact and potential conflict. And has that policy been successful? White Raven asked the same question she had posed to Marshal Bradley 2 years earlier. The governor was honest enough to admit that it had not been. Despite official policies of separation, conflicts between white settlers and Native Americans continued to escalate throughout the territory. The Bitter Creek model, with its emphasis on cooperation and mutual benefit, had achieved better results than any other approach he had seen. What you're suggesting, he said slowly, is a complete reversal of territorial policy. Integration instead of separation, cooperation instead of control. I am suggesting, White Raven replied, that we try approaches that work instead of approaches that sound good to politicians in Washington. The governor spent 3 days in Bitter Creek, interviewing residents, observing the daily operations of the community, and trying to understand how such a radical transformation had been possible. What he found was a community that had learned to value results over ideology, practical solutions over abstract principles. When he returned to the territorial capital, he carried with him a detailed report that would eventually influence policy throughout the American West. The Bitter Creek model became a template for other communities struggling with racial tensions, and White Raven found herself traveling throughout the territory as a consultant and teacher. But her greatest satisfaction came from watching her adopted granddaughter grow into the bridge between worlds that she had always been meant to be. On Isobel's 16th birthday, White Raven presented her with a medicine bag that had been passed down through 5 generations of healers. The bag contained not only traditional Navajo herbs and remedies, but also plants and preparations that Isobel had discovered through her own research and experimentation. "You are ready," White Raven said simply. "Ready to be a healer in your own right, ready to carry forward the work we have begun." Isobel accepted the bag with trembling hands, feeling the weight of responsibility and tradition that came with it. She had grown from a desperate child knocking on doors into a young woman who could move easily between the white Mexican and Navajo communities, serving as translator, mediator, and healer for all of them. "Will you stay in Bitter Creek?" White Raven asked. "No, for now," Isobel replied. "But eventually, I think I need to travel to learn from other healers to carry what we've learned here to other communities that might need it." White Raven smiled, recognizing in her adopted granddaughter the same restless spirit that had driven her own younger self to push boundaries and challenge conventions. "That is as it should be," she said. "Knowledge is meant to be shared, not hoarded. Go where you are called, help where you are needed. And remember that healing is not just about treating sickness. It is about building bridges between people who have forgotten how to trust each other." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Billy Burke, now a tall, serious 18-year-old who had become Isobel's closest friend and partner in their healing work. He carried with him a telegram that had just arrived from the territorial capital, his face grave with the news it contained. "What is it?" Isobel asked, recognizing the expression. "There's been an outbreak of cholera in Silver City," Billy said. "The Territorial Health Board is requesting that we send a medical team to help contain the epidemic." White Raven and Isobel exchanged glances, both recognizing the opportunity and the challenge that the request represented. Silver City was a rough mining town, with a reputation for violence and lawlessness, the kind of place where their integrated approach to healing might not be welcome. "It's dangerous," Billy said. "The telegram mentions that several doctors have already died and the town is in chaos. They might not be receptive to unconventional treatments. All the more reason why we need to go," Isobel said firmly. "If people are dying and traditional medicine isn't working, then they need alternatives. They need hope." White Raven nodded slowly. "Yes, it is time. Time for you to take what you have learned and share it with a world that desperately needs healing." The preparations for the Silver City expedition took several days as they gathered supplies, recruited volunteers, and made arrangements for the continued operation of the Bitter Creek Clinic in their absence. The team that finally departed included not only Isobel and Billy, but also 2 Navajo healers, a Mexican curandera who had joined their community the previous year, and surprisingly, Sheriff Garrett, who had volunteered to help maintain order during the medical emergency. As their wagon train pulled out of Bitter Creek on a crisp autumn morning, the entire town turned out to see them off. Children who had been saved by White Raven's treatments ran alongside the wagons, calling out blessings and good wishes. Adults who had once been ready to commit murder now waved goodbye to the people who had taught them a better way. White Raven stood on the church steps, watching until the wagons disappeared over the horizon. At 72, she was too old for such a journey, but her heart went with them, carrying the hopes and dreams of a community that had learned to believe in the possibility of redemption. Crowfeather joined her on the steps, his weathered face thoughtful, as he watched the dust settle on the empty road. "They will do well," he said in Navajo. "The girl has learned not just healing, but wisdom. She will find a way to reach even the hardest hearts." "I hope so," White Raven replied. "The world is changing, and we need people who can help it change for the better rather than the worse." As they turned to go back into the church, neither of them saw the lone rider watching from the hills above town. He was a young man with the hard eyes of someone who had seen too much violence and the bitter mouth of someone who had lost everything he cared about. His name was Jake Morrison, and he had ridden hard for 3 days to reach Bitter Creek, driven by stories he had heard about the Indian witch who had somehow gained control of an entire white settlement. Jake's family had been killed in a Navajo raid 5 years earlier, the same raid that had claimed Sheriff Garrett's brother. But unlike Garrett, Jake had never learned to let go of his hatred, never found a way to channel his grief into something constructive. Now watching the peaceful scene below, seeing white children playing alongside Indian children, seeing the prosperity and harmony that had grown from cooperation rather than conflict, Jake felt his hatred intensify rather than diminish. This was not how things were supposed to be. This was not the justice his family deserved. As the sun set over Bitter Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake Morrison began to plan his revenge. He would wait until the medical team returned from Silver City, wait until the community was celebrating their success, and then he would strike. He would burn it all down, just as his family's cabin had burned. He would show these people what happened when they forgot the natural order of things, when they let themselves be deceived by Indian magic and Mexican lies. The war between the races was not over, no matter what these fools believed. And Jake Morrison intended to remind them of that fact in the most dramatic way possible. But that confrontation was still weeks away. And for now, Bitter Creek slept peacefully under the desert stars, secure in the belief that understanding had triumphed over hatred, that healing had conquered the urge to destroy. In the clinic, White Raven worked late into the night, preparing medicines and treatments for the patients who would continue to need care, while the main medical team was away. She hummed softly to herself as she worked old songs that her grandmother had taught her, songs about the eternal cycle of growth and decay, destruction and renewal. She did not know about Jake Morrison watching from the hills, did not sense the darkness gathering on the horizon. But even if she had known, it would not have changed what she was doing. Healers healed no matter what the cost, no matter what dangers they faced. That was simply who they were. The telegram from Silver City had arrived at a crucial moment in the community's development, just as the success of their experiment was beginning to attract attention from across the territory. But it had also come at a moment of particular vulnerability when their most experienced healers were about to leave town, and their defenses were at their lowest. It was almost as if someone had planned it that way. But White Raven continued her work, grinding herbs and brewing medicines, preparing for whatever challenges the future might bring. She had faced hatred before and survived it. She had seen communities torn apart by fear and watched them rebuild with love. Whatever was coming, she would meet it as she had met everything else in her long life, with courage, with compassion, and with an unshakable faith in the power of healing to overcome even the deepest wounds. The desert wind whispered through the gaps in the church walls, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of changes yet to come. In the distance, a coyote howled its ancient song of survival, and White Raven smiled, recognizing in that sound an echo of her own determination to endure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that love was stronger than hate, that healing was more powerful than destruction. And when tomorrow came, she would be ready. She had been ready for 72 years, and she would be ready for whatever years remained to her. The doors of Bitter Creek would remain open no matter who tried to close them. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Years later, when historians studied the transformation of the American West, they would point to Bitter Creek as a crucial turning point, the moment when cooperation began to replace conflict as the dominant theme of frontier life. They would write learned papers about the sociological implications of White Raven's healing methods, the political significance of the town's integrated governance, the economic benefits of cross-cultural trade. But the real story was simpler and more profound than any academic analysis could capture. It was the story of a desperate child who knocked on doors until someone answered. It was the story of a community that chose to heal rather than hurt. It was the story of people who discovered that their differences were not walls to divide them, but bridges to connect them. And it was the story of an old woman who taught them that the greatest medicine was not found in herbs or potions, but in the simple act of opening your heart to someone who needed help. That story lived on long after the original participants had passed away, carried forward by the children who had grown up in the new Bitter Creek, who had learned from birth that kindness was stronger than cruelty, that understanding was more powerful than fear. They took that story with them as they spread across the territory, founding new communities, establishing new relationships, building a better world, one door at a time. And whenever they encountered hatred or fear, whenever they met people who had forgotten how to trust, they remembered the lesson of Bitter Creek. Sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to keep knocking, one person who refuses to give up on the possibility that hearts can change. Sometimes, all it takes is the courage to answer when someone asks for help. The doors of Bitter Creek had remained open, and the light that shone through them had illuminated the entire American West. That light was still burning, would always be burning, as long as there were people willing to keep it alive. The story was complete, but the healing it described would never end.